Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor and I'm a Sony Digital Imaging Ambassador, and I want to take a look at Sony's RX1R Mark II camera. This is a full frame sensor in a compact body. Now this camera is not new. In fact, this little camera here is now 10 years old, but it's still selling remarkably well at quite high prices secondhand. Now, if you are wanting to pick up one of these cameras, it does come with a few caveats in that it is a 10-year-old camera. So what I want to do in this video is see whether it's still worth the money that people are asking for this camera, and look at possibilities of maybe if and when Sony are ready to make a Mark III, what that new camera should include. So without much further ado, let's get started. Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor and I'm a Sony Digital Imaging Ambassador, and welcome to my review of Sony's RX1R Mark II camera. Now, I'm not in the habit of reviewing 10-year-old cameras normally, but I'm going to make an exception for this one because it's become somewhat of a modern-day classic camera, the reasons for which will become evident as I walk you through this video review. Now, the RX1 story started way back in 2012. It was using a 24 megapixel full frame sensor, and this was a bit of an achievement for Sony to put this full frame sensor in what is essentially a compact camera. Now, in 2013, this camera was updated to become the RX1R camera. Still 24 megapixels, but they removed the anti-aliasing filter, so the information was even sharper than before. Now, if you are in the market to purchase perhaps one of these cameras second-hand, then you do have to be aware that these 2012 and 2013 models have contrast detect autofocus only with 25 focus points, and there's no electronic viewfinder as pictured in the image to the right here. Now, the whole story changed in 2015 when Sony released its RX1R Mark II with a whopping 42 megapixels, and it was also a backside illuminated sensor. So this really transformed the camera. So much so that Sony was able to put in a 1.4 and 2 times smart teleconverter feature. This essentially allowed you to crop in camera because it was a megapixel rich sensor, giving us 49mm and 70mm full frame equivalent angle of view. You'd still end up with more than 4K resolution if you were cropping in camera to get these alternative focal lengths. The camera also came with a compact finder, which was missing from the 2012 and 2013 24 megapixel versions. Now, this finder was a little bit of a revolution in itself in the fact that it is a 0.39 type with 2.4 million dots. Now, this isn't as good as a modern day A7R5 camera, but it is as good as the A7CII and A7CR viewfinders. Now, remember, this is a 10-year-old camera, so this was amazing for that era. For people who wanted a greater magnification ratio, Sony also made a clip-on FDA EV1 MK finder with a whopping 1.09 times magnification for a really bright big view. Now, surprisingly, I'm sure this camera is probably out of production, but it is still listed as being in stock in the B&H store in the USA. Now, this camera is unavailable in Australia where I'm talking from, but it is listed as in stock, as I said, in B&H. Now, the price is $3,298 US. Now, this is probably the reason why this camera was never a big seller when it was first released 10 years ago. Now, the interesting point here is the used price is still being listed as over $2,300. If you choose a as good as new condition, then you're going to be paying over $2,500 for one of these RX1R Mark II compact cameras. Now, to show you why this is probably one of the reasons it is becoming a classic and a much sought after camera secondhand, is you could actually pick up a 4-year younger A7R IV camera for $400 cheaper secondhand. So that shows you a really high retail value for secondhand models of the RX1R Mark II camera. Now, there are very few equivalent cameras if you are trying to look at alternatives that use full frame sensors. The one that springs to mind is, of course, the Leica Q3, and there is a 43 model of this Q3 camera, 43 being for a 43mm f2 lens. Unfortunately, being a Leica camera, it is just a shade under $7,000 US. So you could pick up more than two of the RX1R Mark II cameras and still have $300 left over in your pocket. But I think these two cameras are basically the full frame compacts that I would normally recommend somebody who is looking for that type of fixed lens full frame camera. I have to say the Leica Q3 43 is not nearly as compact as the RX1R Mark II camera, and this might be a deciding factor whether to go for a modern state-of-the-art fixed lens camera from Leica or the smaller RX1 being a 10-year-old camera. Now I can actually squeeze the RX1R Mark II into a jacket pocket. Not going to get that in my jeans pocket, but I can get it into a jacket pocket, whereas that Q3 is almost certainly going to have to go into a camera bag. The viewfinder experience might be one of the things that put people off using one of these cameras. So if you are in the market for purchasing a second-hand RX1R Mark II camera, see if you can find one that is being sold with the FDA-EV1 MK viewfinder, because that is a compelling additional feature with that 1.9 times magnification ratio. Now the Q3 43, now there is a Leica 3.7 million dot finder there, but it is not available for that Q3 43. It is only compatible with Leica's M10 and M11 cameras. So you are going to get a better viewfinder experience by using the RX1R Mark II, either the pop-up finder, which has a very similar magnification ratio and resolution as the A7CII and A7C finders, or by looking for one of those second-hand viewfinders that clips on to that multi-interface shoe on the top of the camera. Now, if you were to Google what is the world's smallest full-frame camera, you are going to come up with the Sigma FP camera. Now, this is a 24 megapixel camera, and if you add on the optional viewfinder, it is going to be bigger in every dimension, and it is also going to be heavier than the RX1R Mark II. So I still would like to give the title of world's smallest full-frame camera to the RX1R Mark II. And this is again a compelling reason why this is a modern day classic digital camera. Now, I'm giving you a comparison view to an A7CII there, because somebody who's looking for maybe the perfect street camera is obviously going to be looking at these type of cameras. The A7CII stands for compact, but we can see how much smaller that R1 camera is. This is going to be a deciding factor for some people. That older style camera is going to be missing a few features that have been arriving on the later model cameras, and I'll get into more depth with those differences as we move forward. Now, the smallest classic camera I've got that rangefinder, Japanese-made analog camera there, back from 1957, and that digital camera has nearly come in at the same size there. And if we look onto the right side, if we compare it to an RX100 camera. Now, remember, these cameras come with just a 1-inch sensor, and that RX1 carries that full frame sensor. Now, I've put a little bit of a small rig cage because I actually find the little RX100 cameras just a little bit too small to hand hold. I said that this is perhaps a camera that many street photographers will put on a high pedestal here because of its form factor. You're not going to be making a complete spectacle of yourself by walking around with a very large digital camera. When you're walking around with the RX1, it does indeed look like a compact camera. So you are going to go pretty much undercover, under the radar, when working quite close to people in the street. It is also that 35mm focal range on that fixed lens is also a classic field of view for shooting maybe street scenes and also urban architecture, as we can see in this example here. Now, because we don't have the option to zoom, we can crop in camera by using the 1.4 or 2 times smart teleconverter feature, but that is only available when shooting in the JPEG file quality setting. So for me, I'm just going to zoom with my legs. So I've just basically walked into that scene that we previously saw to get a close-up of this little golfing buggy here. Now, there are some details within the scene that I want to go even closer to. So again, I've just zoomed with my legs to get that much closer, tighter shot of what was on the tank behind that golf buggy there. Now, one of the great things about using a compact camera with a full frame sensor is its amazing dynamic range. Here I've lowered the exposure. This is an unprocessed image, and I'm lowering the exposure so I don't overexpose the bright highlights as we can look at over that vineyard in the background. And then all I do is recover all of that shadow information in post-production. And the quality of that shadow information is excellent because remember, it is a backside illuminated sensor harking back to the A7R II, A7R III era. Again, another example, again lowering the exposure using the exposure compensation dial so I'm not overexposing those brightest highlights, and then recovering the shadows in post-production editing just by grabbing that shadow slider and moving it over to the right. Now, if we take a closer look at this Carl Zeiss 35mm f2 lens, there is a macro feature. We can basically turn a dial just behind the focusing ring there to focus on things that are 0.2 to 0.35 meters from the camera. So this allows you to get in close with the camera. It's got quite a reasonable close focusing distance, but as soon as I turn that ring, I can go in even closer for these detailed tight shots that I'm creating here. So when we're working and we're looking at creating maybe a storyboard shot at different distances, I can get the flowers with the landscape behind, I can get in to get a single bloom there, and then I can go in really close by just turning that macro ring on the front of the lens for that real close focusing distance. Again, moving that macro ring away so I can get the broader landscape. I hold up a glass of wine, turn that macro ring and get a really close-up shot of my wine glass there. So there's great flexibility with this particular 35mm Carl Zeiss lens. Now I've moved into a little bit of wine tasting at the vineyard indoors. So the ISO is shot up to 12,800. I've zoomed into 100% magnification in Lightroom here, and there you can see the very small noise structure here. This has been unprocessed for high ISO noise. So this is basically what you're looking at before you are doing the high ISO noise reduction. If you're basically just using or not cropping tightly in post-production, that noise is pretty much okay without having to do any high ISO noise reduction. So this really shows you the advantage of perhaps why you would use maybe a full frame sensor over maybe a fixed lens camera using an APS-C sensor. Now, if we take a look at that Carl Zeiss Sonar f2 35mm lens, it does have a leaf shutter. Now, most cameras have focal plane shutters or electronic shutters. This one has a leaf shutter actually in the lens element itself. So this is some examples. This one wasn't captured with the RX1. It just shows you a particular flash workflow when I'm shooting portraits on location. What I often like to do is I like to underexpose the ambient background by 1 or 2 stops and then fully illuminate the subject with flash coming through a lighting modifier such as a beauty dish or softbox or umbrella. Now I really, with a maximum sync speed on most cameras of 1/160th of a second or 1/250th of a second, I can't really go out into bright conditions without maybe using an ND filter to darken the background or use high-speed sync mode. Now unfortunately with using high-speed sync mode, we are lowering the power of the flash enormously, and that might preclude me from just using a speed light such as one of Sony's speed headlights that we see there, the HVL-F46. So here's another example. Now I'm having to go away from the bright ambient conditions, away from the sunlight, in order to be able to underexpose the background there. Here this time underexposing the background by 1 stop, raising the flash compensation to +1 because the young woman here is wearing white colored clothing. So I'm just having to balance that. Now here's a shot that I captured with flash using Sony's Alpha 9 III camera, which is using the world's first full-frame global imaging shutter. Now this one doesn't have any maximum sync speed because it is a very special sensor that we're using here. Now what I'm able to do here is capture this at a sports event, and this is in full sunlight, but I can pretty much turn day into night by using that 1/8000th of a second sync speed. Okay, so let's take a look at images that I've captured with the RX1R Mark II. Here I'm using a 1/250th of a second sync speed that we might find on cameras with focal plane shutters. And as you can see, as I'm working in a very bright condition here with sunlight around, I can't darken the background anymore. I've already stopped down to f7.1, lowered the ISO to 100, and you see that I'm really still not darkening that background significantly at all. Compare this to the next shot where I've raised the shutter speed to 1/4000th of a second, and a leaf shutter allows me to do this. We don't have the latest Alpha 9 III global shutter sensor, but we do have that leaf shutter that allows me to do a similar sort of thing. So again, I can underexpose the background when I'm working even in sunlit conditions. So that is another compelling reason why the RX1R Mark II is pretty much a classic camera. This might indicate that even though we haven't seen an update to this camera in 10 years, maybe Sony should be thinking of an update for the RX1R Mark II camera. So hopefully, or maybe in 2025, we may see an RX1R Mark III. Now there is a little bit of a challenge ahead for Sony here, and I'm going to try and outline what these challenges might be. Now, if somebody was going to do a checklist of what features you would like to see added to the RX1R Mark II camera for a new and improved version, some people might say, well, let's add in-body image stabilization, because remember, this camera comes from an era that predates in-body image stabilization. Let's also add the larger Z-series battery, because there is a little bit of a pain point with these RX1R cameras in that they do use very, very small batteries. Now, one of the things that only slows the focusing down of this RX1R camera is really the older focus motors. Most of the Sony lenses now use linear XT focus motors, which make the lenses very rapidly focusing. And because this lens predates that technology, the focus isn't quite as snappy as what we might expect, maybe using an A7CII camera and some of the maybe the 24, 40mm and 50mm G compact lenses, which will have snappier focusing. Now, one of the big challenges, however, is when Sony added in-body image stabilization and a larger Z-series battery to the Alpha 6400 APS-C camera, they made the new Alpha 6600 camera 3.5 ounces or 100 grams heavier than the 6400. Now, if Sony took a similar approach by adding the in-body image stabilization and that larger battery to an RX1R Mark II design, it would render it just 2 ounces lighter than a current Alpha 7CR camera, and it wouldn't actually be that much smaller either. So who would buy a fixed lens camera of a very similar size to the current day Alpha 7C II, Alpha 7CR cameras? So I'm going to show you a size comparison of that RX1R Mark II camera with the current Alpha 7CR camera. So there we have the dimensions. Now obviously the RX1R Mark II is appreciably smaller, but if we take a look at the Z-series battery size, the NP-FZ100 size battery, see how much larger it is from the current battery size. Now if we've got to try and accommodate that in the body, we are going to have to enlarge that body size somewhat. So if I just pop it down over the current RX1R Mark II camera and then expand the body out to accommodate that battery, we're also going to have to make the body a little bit thicker if we're also going to add the in-body image stabilization for that IBIS cradle there. So we're going to be looking at a camera now of a very similar form factor to the current A7C II, A7CR cameras. So RX1R II or RX1R III versus an A7CR. Now, obviously the A7CR is already available, so we're not having to wait for that one. So is somebody looking for the perfect street camera prepared to wait only to find that the new version is a very similar size and weight to the current A7CR? So let's take a look at this in a little bit more detail. As we can see there, Sony have done a really good job at keeping both of these cameras really small for the cameras to have that full frame. And remember, the A7CR also has that in-body image stabilization. Now, if we take a look at the cost price, the RX1R, which is a 10-year-old camera, comes in at more than $300 more than a current A7CR. But you have to remember that is body-only price, and you are getting that amazing Carl Zeiss f2 sonar lens with the RX1R Mark II camera. Take a look at side view. I've also put maybe the 40mm f2.5G, which is going to be a popular choice for somebody who decides to go down the interchangeable lens A7C camera rather than the fixed lens RX1 camera choice there. If we look around for other small fixed lens cameras, because we want the camera to be absolutely as small as possible, you might look towards the very, very popular Fujifilm X100 cameras. Now, this APS-C camera is not only lower in resolution, it's also larger and heavier than the RX1R II camera, as you can see from this diagram. There are some smaller Fujifilm cameras, interchangeable lens cameras around, which are quite lightweight. But if we just turn the cameras onto their back, remember this Fujifilm interchangeable lens camera, in order to keep the weight down, doesn't feature in-body image stabilization either. So there is a bit of a level playing field here, except the Sony RX1R Mark II has that full frame sensor. If we lay the cameras down on their back, we can actually see even this Fujifilm M5 camera is still a little bit chunky compared to the RX1R Mark II camera. So we're still getting a slightly better form factor on that 10-year-old camera there. If you wanted to get a much smaller camera, and you will probably have to go into the APS-C sensor size, and you're going to have to go into fixed lens, and you are going to be looking at something like a Ricoh Geo, which has got a bit of a fan club because this is a very small fixed lens camera. It does have an f2.8 lens. Now remember, the RX1R Mark II has an f2 lens, so twice as bright. But if we look at the depth of field equivalent, we have to apply the 1.5 times crop factor, the APS-C crop factor, to that f2.8. So we're only getting depth of field equivalent of f4.2. So you are going to struggle a little bit getting figure ground separation, or making your subjects pop from the background, using an APS-C sensor with a 2.8 aperture lens. So I think most people will probably come, if they value that full frame sensor, will come back to looking at the RX1, a 10-year-old camera, versus the current A7C II and A7R cameras. Now we're looking at a similar price point, and we're looking at a price point there with the lens included on the A7CR camera on the right there. Now you might want to pause this and take a look at the specs. I'll just go through it very briefly here. Now, if you're looking for the lightest camera, it's going to be the RX1R Mark II. If you are looking for that really fast flash sync speed, it is going to be, again, the RX1R Mark II camera, 1/4000th of a second. If we stop the lens down to f5.6, it does have a 1/2000th of a second maximum shutter speed if we're working with 2.8 or f2 aperture values there. Now, all of those little red crosses there are just showcasing this camera is an older 10-year-old camera. There is a bit of a problem with battery life as well. It's got no in-body image stabilization, no AI subject recognition. It's got a USB 2 in-out interface, which is quite slow when we're trying to transfer 42 megapixel files to the camera in RAW file format. We've got the older style menus, and there's no touch menus. And if you are shooting movies or recording movies, they are HD 1080 movies rather than the 4K movies there. So let's just go through those negatives again. No AI subject recognition. The AF precedes the really super sticky 2019 real-time tracking algorithms. The AF motors in the 35mm lens are not linear XT focus motors. So if you're trying to work with f2 and you're just trying to shoot from the hip from people who may be running towards you, you are going to find yourself missing quite a few shots, which you'd probably get with the modern day A7CII cameras and modern day Sony lenses. It's got slower human IAF. They're older IAF algorithms, so if the subject turns to profile view, sometimes the IAF does not kick in. And we've got no animal IAF. We've got pre-2020 menus, and there's no touch menus. 1/2000th of a second maximum shutter speed at f2 and 2.8. If you are working in sunlight, it may require that you use an ND filter on sunny days because you're going to be overexposing your highlights because the ambient light is just too bright for you to use an f2 aperture. We've got no steady shot for stills. We've got digital steady shot for video, but not for stills. We've got HD movies, no 4K movies. No UHS-2 card slots, so we're restricted to using the older SDXC memory cards rather than the SDXC2 memory cards. We've got a slow USB 2 in-out and no Bluetooth. It's NFC and Wi-Fi only. And we've got no APS-C mode. We've got a smart telly 1.4 and 2 times. It's great that we're replicating those 1.4 and 2 times teleconverters that people are used to adding to their telephoto zooms, but it is JPEG only. An APS-C mode on the modern cameras, we're allowed to shoot in RAW format as well. And we've got that small NP-BX1 battery, and when you're working in street photography and the camera is always on, and maybe we've bumped the monitor up to very bright sunny weather conditions, you're going to get as little as 30 minutes on each battery. So you're going to have to put an extra 2 or 3 batteries in your pocket if you intend to do street photography all day. There is, however, some big positives. Remember, this is a classic camera because it is using that 42 megapixel full frame XMOR backside illuminated CMOS sensor. Now this sensor, when this sensor appeared in the A7CII II, I basically turned my back on digital SLRs and I became a mirrorless convert. So this sensor was a big turning point for huge quality improvements in Sony image making. It's also got a very unique piece of technology there, and it's got a variable optical low pass filter. So it allows you to shoot with full detail without an anti-aliasing filter, but if you are getting Moiré, then you can dial in this variable optical low pass filters to try and remove that moire. And we've got a really good Zeiss Sonar T-Star 35mm f2 lens with leaf shutter. So there's a lot going for this camera, and if you are prepared to put up with some of the modern day features that you're going to have to do without, this camera is still going to be a viable option for many photographers. If we take a look at dynamic range comparisons with modern sensors, this is comparing the dynamic range of an RX1R II with the dynamic range of the 60 megapixel backside illuminated sensor featured in the A7R V and A7CII. These are class leading dynamic range, modern dynamic range, and we see that the RX1R II really doesn't lose out that much compared to very modern sensors. So again, posing that question, if this camera is so good, surely we're going to see an RX1R III. if Sony can overcome some of those challenges. And for a lot of street photographers, they might say just keep it small, leave out the in-body image stabilization. I'm just prepared to raise the shutter speed rather than have a bigger body camera. So again, let's take a look at the side-by-side comparisons, because this is going to be a choice that many photographers are going to have to make. Would I feel better about working with an A7CII, a modern camera with all of the bells and whistles, great steady shot, and the option of working with interchangeable lenses, so I can vary my focal length. I don't have to zoom with my feet. And this does allow an owner of one of these A7C II or A7E cameras to adapt a classic glass through lens adapters. Here there's a TechArt adapter. So this is actually making a manual focus Voigtlander lens have a reasonably quick autofocus. Probably not even as quick as the RX1R II, but it does have usable autofocus performance. Or, as you can see in the bag there, we can use modern fast focusing glass. So we are getting choices. The Fujifilm X100VI does have the option of working with converters. We can choose to work with a 28mm or 50mm converter on these cameras. It does, however, make these APS-C cameras even bigger than an A7C II or A7CR camera. So if you are looking for a maximum weight saving and size saving, and you do want a full frame sensor, you are going to move towards the A7C II rather than working with a Fujifilm fixed lens camera and those converters. Now, the A7C cameras have got a little bit of a fan club there, because a lot of people are adapting glass. Some people are adapting Leica lenses from 25-30 years ago, or if you're just a little bit more on a tighter budget, maybe the Voigtlander lenses. Here this is a knocked-on 35mm f1.4 lens on that TechArt AF adapter. Now, I went out and just reviewed this particular lens camera combination. Now, if you're going to get a really acceptable sharpness, you are going to be stopping down from 1.4 down to a working aperture of f2 to get a good deal of sharpness across the frame there. But when you've done that, you're basically working with classic vintage styled glass on a modern day camera. And as you can see from these examples, and I'll put a link in the video below so you can take a look at these examples captured on RX1R II cameras and also A7C cameras using this more vintage style glass here. So as you can see, even with a 35mm lens working at f2, we can get good figure ground separation when we're going in for these tighter head and shoulder portraits. You don't need that f1.2 50mm lens or a 1.4 85mm lens. If you're just prepared to step a little bit closer to your subjects, you can get excellent figure ground separation. And remember, we have that 35mm f2 choice on the RX1R II cameras. So if you decide that, yes, I do need that snappier focus, then of course we do have a range of fast focusing compact lenses. Now, you won't get the 1.4 in the 1.2 form factor, but here's Sony's 40 and 50mm G lenses working with 2.5 apertures there. And you can see they're fully featured lenses, as well as having those XT linear focus motors. Another choice for somebody who chooses an A7C interchangeable lens camera over and above a fixed lens 35mm lens there is that you could also work with some classic Sony digital glass. These are Sony's oldest E-mount FE primes here, the 35 2.8 Zeiss lens and the 55 1.8 Zeiss lens. 4.3 ounces from that 35 2.8 lens and just 10 ounces for that 55mm lens. They're really sharp, even though they're now 12-year-old lenses. They're still very sharp lenses. And you can even put some vintage retro style lens hoods on these cameras, as I've done in this particular example here. I carried this two lens combination, this Zeiss Duo, into this very small Wotancraft Cantina bag there, and this gave me almost a perfect street setup. And here are some examples captured with the 35 2.8 in Italy, doing a little bit of street photography in Umbria here, and this one captured in Venice on a rainy day, and this one up at Lake Garda. Even though it's only got a 2.8 aperture, I'm still able to handhold and get some reasonably good shots even at the high ISO, even if it means just putting a little bit of a high ISO noise reduction in post-production editing. And this one, a long exposure handheld in Venice here. Some choices there for somebody who's going for maybe the Alpha 7C. But let's switch back now to the RX1R Mark II camera using that fixed 35mm cast size lens. And I took this out a number of times just around Melbourne and also a vineyard in order to get some examples of what you can expect from working with this particular camera. Now, I do a lot of street photography. I did have to slow my workflow down just a little, just to make sure that the camera was tracking the subject. I couldn't always guarantee, like I can with an Alpha 7C to a modern Sony lens, that it's always going to lock on first time. And if I'm using the IAF, I do have to hold down a custom key program to IAF in order for that to engage, because 10 years ago that's the workflow that we used to do. It didn't auto engage with the IAF. But as you can see from these images, and I will make high resolution versions of these images available on my Flickr Pro account here. But as you can see, that 35mm is pretty much a classic focal length for doing a lot of street and documentary work. And we do have, as we get in close, we do have that opportunity to get some creative shallow depth of field with this particular lens. Here's a little bit more of a grab shot that did work. I almost didn't stop walking as I was passing this group in a laneway, and it's a dark laneway, so high ISO working with this in order to grab this shot, and I did get the face that I intended to be in sharp focus. These are the shots which are a lot more reliable, where we find somebody in the street scene which is pausing, and we can actually just take a little bit more longer, maybe an additional 1 or 2 seconds, just to ensure we actually have sharp focus at the focal point where we want it. And again, a little bit of urban architecture, and this lens lends itself to this really, really well. We really don't have to worry about dust spots on the sensor if we are stopping down to f11, f16, because remember, you can't get dust on a sensor if you can't remove the lens. So that could be seen as another positive when we are shooting urban landscapes at those smaller apertures. And again, pretty much wide open. Step back a couple of steps, we do have sufficient depth of field to get pretty much everything in sharp focus. And we got quite a few shots where I just bumped the shutter speed to maybe 1/500th of a second, just to ensure that I was getting sharp information. And the depth of field, I might just stop down to f4 just to ensure if there is a little bit of a focus area, I am still going to get sharp focus. Moving out into the a winery shoot now, with some of the tanks for the making of the wines here, going in a little bit closer for some of the shadow detail, stopping down maybe to f11 to get that deep depth of field from foreground to background there. Again, sort of a smaller aperture type shot here. Going in very, very close with that macro feature now, working maximum aperture f2 to get that really shallow depth of field and figure ground separation. Again, going in really close, maximum aperture to get a little bit of peeling tree bark on this eucalypt tree here. Again, stopping down maybe to f8, and some of the feedback I can give you using this camera compared to maybe an Alpha 7C II or Alpha 7CR camera. These are my takes on that particular experience. Now, the first thing I noticed is I'm a big fan of the zone, the AF tracking zone focus area, and we have wide and we have the spot focuses, but there was no zone option. And I did have to be aware of that slower AFC. So I attribute that mostly not to the sensor but to the focus motors in that lens. So any new version of this camera would almost certainly resolve that. There is no option to change the color of the focus area to red. So when I was using a spot, sometimes with that gray focus area, sometimes it was a little bit hard to recognize where maybe the off-center spot had been moved to. Face recognition, but no auto IF, so I had to access the IF by holding down a custom key. It's got the older AF performance, so sometimes if the face is slightly obscured or the sitter turns into profile view, the IF isn't guaranteed to kick in. That 1/2000th of a second maximum shutter speed did rear its head, so I've either got to stop down to maybe f4 or I've got to put on an ND4 or ND8 filter on front of the lens. It switches too quickly from the monitor to the EVF, so the little eye sensor is a little bit over keen. Sony resolved this on later models, and if you flip out the monitor on later model Sony cameras, it prevents the camera from automatically switching to the finder if the camera body is moved very close to your chest, which is often what I do when I'm shooting using the finder. So the workaround for this is just to push the pop-up finder down back into the camera body, and then it forces the camera to stay on the monitor. We've got that shorter battery life, so you're going to need to purchase at least 2 more additional little batteries in order to go through a whole day. And I've also invested in a little battery charger, so I can be charging one in camera and one in the battery charger when I find that I'm back at the end of the day. Here's another thing to note is if you are going to be looking for maybe one of the second-hand RX1R II cameras, just check the status of that internal battery. That's not the little pop-in battery. That's the internal battery, which just keeps a memory of the date and year that you've set on the camera. So if you are have the opportunity to test maybe a 9-year-old camera, just set the date and time, pop out the battery, put in the battery again, and just see whether it's remembered the date and time. If it hasn't, then there's a good chance that internal battery has gone completely flat, and that might need, if it can't be recharged and keep its charge, you may be looking at sending the camera for repair, for that camera to be dismantled and the battery replaced. So I've had a really good experience with reviewing the RX1R II camera that I borrowed. Now, after experiencing the RX1R II firsthand, would I buy one secondhand? Now, that's a good question, and I am sort of keen to sort of track one down, even though they do command a very high price. But because it's a classic camera, I don't expect, if I did purchase one, a mint condition one secondhand, I don't expect it to depreciate very quickly, if at all, because it is a certified classic in my opinion. Now, if I am looking for one, I'd probably try to seek one out with the plug-in viewfinder that goes onto that multi-interface shoe. I would really like a big 1.09 times magnification, and also a finder that I can angle when I'm shooting from my chest. So I think that is going to be something that I will start looking for now. Now, some people might say, but yes, maybe I should wait for the RX1R III. And there is a chance that this camera will never appear because of those challenges that I've outlined that face Sony. They will possibly want to put in body image stabilization, and if they do and put in a larger Z series battery, then it's going to be a very similar size to the A7CII cameras, and I already have an A7C II camera that I use for street. So there is a big question hanging over this decision for me. I've enjoyed my experience with this camera though, and if you are in the market for a street camera, then I would recommend this particular camera. It is going to be a classic for probably for the many years to come. If you'd like to catch up with me online, just head over to patreon.com/Mark Gaylor. You will find an ebook for your late model alpha camera. And when I say late model, I mean anything from 2009 onwards. My Premium Plus patrons have access to Q&A forums where I can resolve any manner of technical problems that they might be facing, and also give them advice about purchasing of gear, maybe the correct choice for lenses when people are going on safari or maybe going overseas. So I've also got over 30 hours of member-only seminars, which are video seminars on all manner of topics related to photography, including post-production workshops where users can download the raw files that I'm working with in those post-production workshops. You can also download raw files from my lens and camera reviews, and also camera setup files, sometimes referred to as cam set files, so I can set up your camera as outlined in the 600 and 700 page ebooks for your camera. So there's a quick overview of just some of the ebooks I've created. And remember, there are ebooks that are not specific to particular cameras, such as working with landscape, working with flash, etc. And just an outline of just some of the many seminars that I create for my patrons. So hopefully you've enjoyed this RX1R Mark II review, and just give me the thumbs up if you have. Make sure you subscribe so you can watch my future videos, and I'll catch you online next time.